Hi, everybody. Welcome to this short session. Tim Baker is my name. I want to talk about feedback, and in particular, I want to talk about the way it can be framed to be more effective. And there are a number of things that need to be done. I think the surveys show us that employees don't feel that they're getting enough feedback from their managers. And when I talk about feedback, I'm talking about both positive and constructive feedback. But people are saying over and over again, they're not getting enough feedback. And the question then is, obviously, the quality and the quantity needs to be increased. So we're going to look at a few of those key points here in our short session together. And hopefully it'll give you a sense of what needs to happen and how you can maximize the effect of your feedback. Because obviously the whole idea of giving feedback is to either modify behavior or to actually reinforce it. So if it's good feedback, positive feedback, it's about reinforcement. And of course, if it's constructive feedback, it's about changing it. So let's get stuck into it. I'll just share my screen and then we'll move into the session. So this comes from my latest book, Mastering Feedback, A Practical Guide to Better Leadership Conversations. And that book's available, and we'll talk about that a little more shortly. So let's just consider, first of all, in case you don't know who I am, just a quick overview. You can see that I'm obviously an author. I've got 14 books out. My latest, of course, is this book, Mastering Feedback. I am a keynote speaker. I'm an executive coach. I run workshops, and you can see up in the top left-hand corner, I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane, and which we only play every second week because it takes 2 weeks to recover. Okay, let's talk about that at my age. Let's talk a little bit about feedback. Now, the question that might be on your mind is, how do I minimize friction when giving constructive feedback? That's not the only barrier, but it's certainly one that lots of people grapple with. And what happens is often leaders don't give the feedback because they're concerned that it won't land properly or that people might get defensive about it. But of course, I also point out that positive feedback is critical to people's success as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about feedback and engagement because I think it's important to realize that there is a research correlation between feedback and engagement. I want to just talk about that for a moment. Then I'll talk about some of the key factors to improve your effectiveness and maximize the impact that feedback has. And I've got a special offer at the end of our presentation today. Okay, so this graph sort of illustrates the connection between feedback and engagement. So you can see that there are 3 levels or 3 bars. The top bar shows, and blue is positive, by the way, bluey green, and red is negative. So if you look up at the top bar, and if your team members only ever receive positive feedback, I should say. If they only ever receive positive feedback, that's all that you do. You say thank you at the appropriate times, you give feedback when people have done it right, and that's all you do. It's likely that that will boost engagement significantly. So, I mean, the easiest thing for all of us to do is just to give more positive feedback. That's going to contribute enormously to engagement levels in your team. And as we know, engagement levels are very low around the world. Surveys show it over and over again. So just by doing that, you will lift engagement levels. Interesting enough, on the second bar there, if you only ever give what's called constructive feedback or critical feedback, that's all you do every time something's not done according to how it needs to be done, and you give feedback about that, it's still likely that people will be engaged, assuming, of course, it's done the correct way. And so clearly, if you just give more regular feedback, whether it's positive or constructive, and you do it the right way, it will contribute to higher levels of engagement without a doubt. I think what's interesting in this graph is the bottom the bottom column, and that is if people receive no feedback at all, whether it's positive or negative, you'll find that you will have disengaged employees. And I think there's a psychological reason for that. I think people need to know where they stand. They want to know where the line in the sand is. They want to know whether they're doing it right or not. And really, that's the key message there, that no feedback leads to disengagement. And so it's very, very important. And this is backed up by the research. So it's very, very important that we give people regular feedback, both constructive and positive feedback. So the question then is, how do we do that in a way that's effective? So here are some of the ingredients of effective feedback that are critical to you being successful as a leader. I would suggest to you that one of the most critical factors is timing. And what I mean by that essentially is that soon after the event or the critical incident that you give feedback, the better. So, if somebody has spoken to somebody and they've done it in a very negative way, a damaging way, the best time to give feedback is straight after that conversation. Or if somebody's produced a shoddy report, the best time to give feedback is straight after you receive that report. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, it's fresh in people's mind. That's one reason. So therefore, it's a bit difficult to dispute the facts. I mean, if you said to somebody, you gave someone feedback 6 months after the event, it's probably likely that it will be ineffective because people won't remember what the feedback's about, let alone believe it's very relevant. And the reason that they won't believe it's relevant is that if it was relevant, it's probably likely that you would have given that feedback 6 months ago at the time. So feedback is critically important in a timely way. Now, of course, there are some impediments to that. The truth is we're all busy people, so it may be quite difficult for you to give feedback in a timely manner because you're doing something else. But the longer you leave it until you give the feedback, the less impact it will have. And for those reasons that I've mentioned. So timing is critical. You've actually got to find the time to give the feedback at the time of the incident or the event. So that's critical. Secondly, feedback's got to be specific. And you've heard this before, I know, but often when people make generalizations about feedback, what happens, of course, is that it becomes personal. And people, of course, are confused about what the feedback's about. I would strongly suggest that before you give someone feedback, you think very carefully about what you're going to say, the first words that come out of your mouth. If necessary, get a pen and paper out and write down the words that you're going to express. Now, you might think that's a little strange, but obviously you can't take those words back once they come out. So make sure that you think very carefully about how specific the feedback is. And I'm going to give you an example of this because I think sometimes it sounds like a little bit of a generalization. Have a look at this feedback. Now, just imagine if I gave you this feedback. So and it's timely, so let's assume it's timely. And you've just given a presentation to the team meeting. And I've pulled you aside in the corridor and I've said to you, overall, good job on the presentation at this morning's meeting, but it could have been better. Now, if I've given you that feedback, what are you going to think about? Obviously, you're going to think, well, what did I do wrong? Because that last sentence, but it could have been better, is a bit vague. It's a generalization. Doesn't give me any hint about what I could do better. And so therefore, I'm going to latch onto that and completely miss the point of the first sentence, which is that you were pleased with the presentation. So that's not going to be effective. This would be a more effective piece of feedback. So if I said to you, same situation, you've just given a presentation at this morning's meeting, and I said to you, great job on the presentation. I really liked how you used statistics to back up your key points. One small comment, maybe for next time, you could invite more comments from the group and get them more involved. Now we're starting to be effective because, one, I've complimented the person on the presentation, but not only have I done that, I've explained to them why I like the presentation, the fact that they use statistics to back up their key points. So I've been very specific about that. But I've also been very specific about my constructive criticism as well, where I've said maybe for next time you could invite more comments from the group to get them more involved. Now, it may well be that that person might agree with you about that. So they might say to you, yeah, I was a little nervous and I probably should have asked more questions, engaged more people. So you see, it's more likely that that specific feedback is going to be effective. And so much so that they may well agree with your feedback. So it needs to be timely and it needs to be specific. What's the third factor? The third factor is that feedback must be given every day, frequently. So you've got to look for situations, projects, critical incidents, and give the feedback straight after those events in a very specific manner. So really, feedback is part of your job. It's part of my job. And what we've got to do is get used to giving regular feedback every day. I think a good rule of thumb is to find 3 things every day that you can give feedback about. Now, remember, you don't have to sit there for a long period of time. You can simply let the person know specifically what it is you liked or didn't like about what they did, and that's enough. So I think it's got to be regular. And unfortunately, when we get performance reviews, often what happens is managers will wait till the performance review and give the feedback then. And they'll dump all the feedback on the person at the time. And it's not a good idea because obviously, you know, we've certainly violated a couple of issues there. One is, of course, it's not timely. And it may not be specific because maybe we can't even remember what it is that they did or didn't do. And it's certainly not frequent. So that's why it's important not to leave it for that performance review. A fourth factor is that you need to engage them in a conversation around feedback. This is not you just having a one-way monologue. You've got to make it a dialogue. And what you've got to do in order to get that happening as a conversation is to ask questions. So in other words, ask them how they thought they went in whatever it is that you're giving feedback about before you jump in and give your suggestions. The way to do that, of course, is to ask open-ended questions. Why, what, where, who, when, how, and which. If you ask those questions, you're going to get more than a yes or no. So what did you think about your presentation at this morning's meeting? All right. Why did you say what you said at the team meeting this morning? So all of these type of questions allow the other person to get on the front foot and give you some commentary about the issue that you want to talk to them about. So I honestly believe that feedback is a conversation. As I said, it's a dialogue, not a monologue. So try to get the other person engaged in the feedback, I think, is very important. This is particularly relevant when we've got people working remotely, because obviously you're not hovering over them in the room. They're probably working from home. And so the idea is you don't really know. And in those instances, you should be asking people for feedback about their own performance. And then you can certainly chime in at the appropriate time. If you disagree with it, you can disagree. If you agree with it, you can agree. But at least the other person's got skin in the game and they're engaged in the feedback process. And I think that's really important. So that's the fourth issue. And I think as leaders, what's happened is that we've been brought up with the idea of answering questions, not asking questions. Most leaders gravitate to leadership positions because they've got good technical know-how, and technical competence is really around answering questions. So leaders are in the business of asking questions, not answering questions. I also think that it's critically important when you're giving constructive feedback to do it in private. Now, there's an old adage that you praise in public and criticize in private. Now, generally speaking, I understand the thrust of that, but I honestly think that there are many people that actually don't like attention being drawn to them. And I believe the safety first principle would be to praise in private and criticize in private. I think it's a far better way, because some people just feel very embarrassed being made the center of attention in front of the rest of their team members. So I think probably the best way to go is just to give the feedback in private. And I think often when I see managers giving feedback, I often think it's more about them than it is about the person that they're giving the feedback to. So I think as a good rule of thumb, all feedback should be done in private. But I can understand if you're giving feedback to a team, for example, then clearly there's no other way than to do that in public, that is with the team in the room. But I think if it's an individual, it's probably better to give the feedback in private. Now, all feedback should be based on critical incidents. And what I mean by that is that there's got to be some example or some situation where, you are basically framing your feedback. So, for example, if someone's late to a meeting, then obviously the critical incident is the fact that they've been late to the meeting, rather than to berate them about always being late, talking about the meeting that they weren't punctual at is obviously the critical incident in that case. And this is why it's really important to give the feedback straight after the event, because it's fresh in the mind of the other person. The incident has occurred, and clearly both of you can address that straight after the incident. So critical incidents are really powerful ways of being able to contextualize your feedback. So again, it's all about doing it in the moment. The other reason why that's important is that when you give people feedback immediately after a critical incident, they get the idea by your example that you think that this is extremely important, because obviously you've got priorities, you've got lots of things that you could be doing at the time. But for you to actually down tools and give that person feedback straight after an incident suggests very strongly to the other person that you think it's important, whether it's positive or constructive. Now, remember that all feedback ultimately is about one objective, and that is the future. And I mention this because I think many of us get caught up in what happened, or why'd you do this, or whatever. I think at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because what's happened is it's gone. The past is finished. The only reason that we give feedback to anybody is either to, if it's positive feedback, to encourage them to continue to do what they did. So that's positive feedback. So that's all about the future. That's reinforcing what they did for the future. Or the other reason for giving feedback is to change or modify someone's behavior for the future. So I just think that often what happens in conversations is we get caught up in this and that. Certainly you need to collect your evidence. You certainly need to be accurate. But at the end of the day, this is all about the future. It's not about the past. And the sooner you can get on the front foot and talk about the future in a feedback session, the better, both for you and for the other person. And that is about maximizing the impact of feedback for the future. So it's all about the future. Now, a couple of things when you're dealing with a difficult session of feedback. This is the negative feedback or the constructive feedback. This is when things can get heated, or maybe things aren't working to the way, it's not a civil conversation. The first and most important rule about all this is you must avoid confrontation and argument. Your job is not to argue with someone. And if you start getting into an argument with somebody about something that they did or didn't do, that's not going to be effective. So there are two strategies you can use there that are very useful. One is you could say to the other person, I refuse to argue with you about this. Now, when you say to someone, I refuse to argue with you about this, you've basically cut it off. In other words, it's pointless for them to continue to attempt to argue with you because you've drawn a line in the sand and you've claimed that you refuse to argue about it. Now, the other tactic you could use there, of course, is that you can agree to disagree. So if it's a relatively minor point, you can just simply say to the other person, let's agree to disagree. And that moves the conversation on to the future and what has to happen going forward. But you will not win an argument in a feedback session. You might think you've won it, but ultimately it's not going to be effective, and that person will resent you, and you will find that they won't take on any of the feedback that you've given them for the future. The focus has got to be on performance, of course. And every time you and I give feedback to someone, it's not personal, it's performance-based. So the idea is for us to focus on the behavior that occurred. And if it's positive behavior, then obviously you call it out as positive behavior. And if it's negative behavior, you call it out and you talk about the negative behavior, but you don't talk about the individual as such. As I said earlier, it's really important to focus on the future. And ultimately, that's all you're trying to mold is the future. So please don't get caught up in a discussion about he said this or she said that. The key thing here is to be able to shape the future. And that's ultimately what that's about. So if someone wants to argue about the detail, you can just say to them, you could say to them, look, this is all about the future. I just want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. Okay, so just bring the conversation to the future rather than arguing about the past. It's a good idea when you're giving feedback, even if it is constructive feedback, to try to end on a positive note. Now, look, there is a little school of thought about, the sandwich metaphor where you give positive feedback, then you give the negative feedback, then you give the positive feedback at the end. I'm not sure that's very effective because all you're really trying to do is to hide the real feedback. And really, I want the person to actually understand what the feedback's about. But there's nothing to stop you at the end of that is to say to the other person, I'm very confident that you can, change this for the future or not do this again next time. Now, you're not being hypocritical by saying that, because if you didn't think that they could change their behavior, then the question must be raised, why are you giving the feedback in the first place? So emphasize that you believe that they can make the change, and that should terminate the conversation. Now, the other point about this, and this is coming back to this focus on the future, it's important for you to make sure you completely understand what happened. So if it's fairly complex, I think it's very important for you to ask a lot of questions so that you can understand the causes, seek out the causes of the problem. So you might start by saying to someone, do you mind if I ask you some questions so I can understand exactly what happened? And that's a good thing to ask. And then, of course, no one's going to say no to that. It's a closed question. They'll say yes. And then you go ahead and ask a number of open-ended questions so that you can understand the situation well. Now, once you've understood it, then you move on, of course, to focus on the future. So, folks, that's pretty much it for me today. I would just remind you that every Friday at this time at 10 o'clock, I have one of these sessions that comes from one of my books. Next week, I've got another session on the 7 keys to managing expectations. Managing expectations is not easy, and it sounds such a simple concept, But there are a number of factors involved in this. And what I want to do next week is talk about what they are. In fact, there are 7 key factors. What are they? And what can you do to make sure that your expectations are being met? That's ultimately what that's about. So join me at 10 o'clock next week to register. You'll be receiving a copy of these slides and recording today. And you just need to click on that link. And just like you did today, you'll be registered to join me next Friday. Now, before we wrap up, I just want to mention to you that my book is available on Amazon at the moment for $25 plus postage. And if you purchase that book today directly from me, I'll give it to you for half price plus postage, and I'll also sign it for you and send it out. So if you're interested, you'd like to take advantage of that opportunity, just send me an email today by the close of business. I will make sure that you're on the list, and I will send out a copy of your book promptly with an invoice, and you'll get your book very quickly. So that's an offer just for today. And it's an offer because you've taken time out of your busy schedule to be here with me today. So that's it from me. I'll just close out. So thanks, everyone. I hope some of those issues are helpful for you, just to remind you of some of the really important points around giving feedback. They're not difficult, but often, sometimes in the heat of the moment, we forget about them, or we don't pay lip service to them. So it's very important to be timely. It's very important to be very specific. It's important to ask questions. It's important to use critical incidents to focus attention. It's important to focus on the future. And finally, it's important to give feedback, I believe, in private, regardless of whether it's positive or negative feedback. So thanks, everyone, for your time. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And hopefully I look forward to seeing you next Friday. All the very best. Thank you and goodbye.